Now I will tell you which way to think in order to free yourself from the compulsive desire to see your fault in everything and put your imperfection as the cause of all unpleasant events. Guilt can arise for many reasons, including mistakes made in the past or the perception that you are not good enough in various aspects of life. It can be related to personal failures, disappointment of loved ones, or violating one's own standards and expectations. Guilt can lead to negative consequences such as depression, anxiety, and low self-esteem. It can also affect relationships by causing distrust and resentment. To get rid of this feeling, it is important to not only recognize its origin, but also to learn how to work with it constructively. One of the first steps in this process is to recognize that guilt is a normal human emotion that should not, however, become obsessive or destructive. Primary guilt and cognitive effort and thinking is necessary because primary guilt is an experience that will require cognitive effort to process. Psychoanalysis does not use methods that exclude the client from responsibility, such as suggestion or persuasion, but it does require the client to be intellectually capable. So working with primary guilt must begin at least with the realization that one cannot be guilty of everything. Of course, it may feel differently, but to know or at least guess that, for example, the person who offends you before you 30 years formed other people and circumstances, and not you, still need to. In working with primary guilt, it is important to recognize that our perception of the situation is often distorted. Often we take more responsibility than we really deserve and see ourselves as the cause of all problems. This can happen due to a variety of factors, including upbringing, cultural norms, and personal psychological traits. For example, people who grew up in an environment where they were constantly indoctrinated to be perfect and never make mistakes can be particularly plagued by guilt. If the primary guilt is not perceived as something abnormal, strange, or alien, then it is unlikely that it can be worked with in a depth approach. Different magical methods or the same suggestion will do. It is important to realize that working with guilt requires time and patience. It is a process that involves being aware of your emotions, analyzing your thoughts, and gradually changing your perception and behavior. Various therapeutic approaches can help with this, including cognitive behavioral therapy, which helps to change negative thought patterns and behavioral responses. Working with aggression. The next and primary step is, of course, working with aggression. You remember that primary guilt is anger intended for parents but directed against oneself, right? It's important to realize that aggression can be a constructive force if used correctly. It can help set boundaries, protect oneself, and achieve one's goals. However, if aggression is directed inward, it can cause feelings of guilt and self-punishment. Working with aggression is definitely included in therapy for any emotional state because aggression, if worked correctly, will protect us and move us toward our goals, and normal guilt, which doesn't need to be gotten rid of, will help keep us from destroying people in the process. In the case of primary guilt, it will be necessary to return to the aggression that was once rightly addressed by the parent. This process may involve a variety of techniques such as expressing anger through written exercises, talking to a therapist, or even physical exercise to safely release the accumulated aggression. Anecdotes and the realities of therapy. Remember the anecdote when a person comes to a therapist and the therapist replies, "Why don't we just blame it on your mom and get out early?" Frankly, if it could be done so easily, it would really save time, effort, and money. It often happens that in the head of a person tightly sits, it is impossible to be angry with parents, and it takes years of work to break this poisonous thought. People who tend to rationalize like to say that, yes, it is possible to be angry with your parents, but I understand that they lived their lives as they knew how, there were no psychologists then, it was hard for them too, etc. It's hard to argue, of course, but what to do with anger directed at oneself? This rationalization can be an obstacle in therapy, as the person may not allow themselves to feel legitimate anger, which interferes with the healing process. It is important to work on accepting one's emotions as they are and not trying to justify or ignore them. The extremes of anger and working with it, or there is the other extreme, where people come in with anger at their parents and stay with it for years. This, too, does not indicate a release from the primary blame, although it seems to take the anger away from the self. First, often such a person, while angry at his parents in the psychologist's office, continues to play the good child in his relationship with them, protecting them and himself from his aggression, which still speaks to the infantile idea that he or the parents will be destroyed by his anger, and does not allow the aggression to quietly fulfill its protective and developmental functions. Second, behind the unrelenting anger, and anger is a contact emotion, hides the hope that after all, Mommy will hear, Mommy will come. I'm just not yelling hard enough. Same primal guilt, only viewed from the side. This anger can become chronic and destructive if not handled properly. Therapy can help a person learn to express their emotions in a healthy way and let go of old resentments, sadness, and insight. I have told you that a child who does not receive the care he needs at an early age first angrily tries to draw his mother's attention to himself, and then the realization should come to him that he is alone and inconsolable. But it doesn't come because he is still too mentally weak for such a horrible realization. As defense comes only primary guilt, so the next step in working with guilt is the bitter epiphany and the associated sadness that the childhood they write about in sunny children's books did not happen and will never happen. The sadness destroys any hope of a good mother and legitimately allows the anger to subside. This is probably the most painful stage in primary guilt therapy, finding out that you are truly alone in the world. And at the same moment, psychological maturation begins. Recognizing your vulnerability and loneliness can be extremely difficult, but it is an important step toward emotional healing. It is important to learn how to deal with this pain and use it for personal growth. Therapy can provide support and tools to get through this process, as well as help build new, healthy ways of interacting with the world and the people around you.